If you are wondering why the picture on this 65-inch Panasonic GZ2000 looks so blue, it is because this in-TV demo footage can only be run in dynamic mode, which is somewhat ironic for a company that prides itself on color accuracy. Once I press a button on the remote control to try and change the picture settings, the demo loop will stop. Let me restart the demo loop and show you some interesting findings on the Panasonic GZ2000. Contrary to pre-launch reports from Japan, our 65-inch Panasonic GZ2000 review sample is not equipped with LG Display's latest, more efficient OLED panel from Guangzhou, or what's commonly known as the EVO panel. As a result, full-field brightness remained capped at 140 nits, which is typical of non-EVO WRGB OLED panels, even though the presence of a heatsink allowed the GZ2000 to reach a peak brightness of 900 nits on a 10% window after calibration to D65 white point, similar to what we measured on last year's HZ2000 OLED. Interestingly, the GZ2000 was not as resistant to image retention as its HZ2000 and GZ2000 predecessors. As you can see from this test where we displayed a peak white 10% window in HDR at full blast for 10 seconds, then switched to a full field grace light. Perhaps Panasonic has changed the thickness, surface area or composition of the heatsink on the GZ2000, which would also explain its lighter weight compared to the HZ2000 or GZ2000. Over the years, we have on multiple occasions praised the near black handling of Panasonic OLEDs, but unfortunately the GZ2000 fell somewhat short of the very high standards we've come to expect from the company. On this 10-bit HDR moving quantization test pattern developed by Stacy Spears of Spears & Mansell fame, near black gradation was coarser than what we've seen on the HZ and GZ series OLEDs, as if it's rendered at a lower bit depth. I will reveal the culprit at the end of this video after I finish presenting all my findings, so stick around. As a consequence of this coarser above black gradation, bit-starved content, such as this heavily compressed broadcast footage from Game of Thrones, exhibited more macro blocking and posterization than LG and Sony OLED televisions, partly undoing Panasonic's hitherto class-leading suppression of near-black flashing artifacts. Imagine there are two shades that are quite close to each other. A coarser gradation means that the difference between them would be greater, significantly increasing the chance of chrominance overshoot. And unlike Sony and LG, Panasonic hasn't implemented a dedicated smoke gradation decontouring filter on their OLED models, including the GZ2000, giving us no way to smooth out the posterization. The MPEG Remaster spatial filter did not help at all, even at the highest setting. The coarser near-black gradation would occasionally also manifest itself in high bitrate material, including 4K Blu-ray movies, such as in the opening credits of Sicario, or this dark scene from Pan, especially along the shadows on the arm of the eponymous hero. Despite this shortcoming, the Panasonic GZ2000 was on the whole still able to present clearer, more accurate shadow detail than Sony OLEDs, thanks to outstanding factory calibration and the provision of near-black calibration controls below 5% video stimulus. Out-of-the-box color accuracy was equally impressive, with no inaccuracies exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold delta error 3 on this challenging color checker SG chart where 140 patches were measured, and this is just in the SDR filmmaker mode before any sort of calibration. Of course, even the most basic calibration can still improve color accuracy further, but if you don't intend to get your TV calibrated, the Panasonic GZ2000 should do better than its rivals in faithful reproduction of the creative intent in real-world content. Talking about calibration, this video is sponsored by UK electrical retailer Kernel More, who have started selling pre-calibrated televisions under my supervision. If you are thinking about getting a new television, even if it's not the Panasonic GZ2000, please support this channel by considering buying from them. Call 0113 244 6607, mention HDTV test, and you will receive great price and service. Thanks again for your support. Okay, an integral component of artistic intent in films is accurate representation of 24p motion, and the Panasonic JZ2000 correctly applied 5.5 pull down to prevent telecinic judder, even with intelligent frame creation disabled. While pre-2021 Panasonic OLEDs suffered from intermittent frame skipping in certain HDR scenes containing smoke or fog, this is now fixed. Finally, on the JZ2000, judging from this sequence in War for the Planet of the Apes, although bear in mind that engaging intelligent frame creation would reintroduce the frame skipping. With intelligent frame creation off, motion resolution came in at the sample and hold baseline of 300 lines. The eagle-eyed among you may have spotted some scrambling artifacts at the 170 level, indicating some undefeatable interpolation similar to what we've observed on the Sony A90J and A80J. Engaging intelligent frame creation would more than double motion resolution to 650 lines, with the potential to go up to 1080 lines or beyond with black frame insertion thrown into the mix. Things got interesting once we went into the intelligent frame creation custom submenu. Normally, blur reduction would apply motion interpolation to 50 fps or 60 fps content to improve motion clarity, but it didn't increase motion resolution at all on the Panasonic JZ2000. Film Smooth is supposed to reduce judder in 24 fps, 25 fps or 30 fps content, but going up by one click was enough to boost motion resolution to 650 lines on this 60 fps test pattern. In other words, Film Smooth on the Panasonic JZ2000 now behaves similarly to the smoothness setting on Sony OLEDs, without independent deblur and dejudder controls, and we wondered if this change was implemented to tackle the aforementioned 24p frame skipping issue in smoky or foggy HDR scenes. Just like on last year's HZ series, the variable intensity blood frame insertion or BFI on the Panasonic JZ2000 can be used in conjunction with intelligent frame creation to achieve higher motion clarity without significant flickering or screen dimming. Because intelligent frame creation seemed to operate in a 60Hz centric manner, very rarely its algorithm would cause microstutter or frame drops in 50 frames per second material, be it a UK news broadcast with mixed edits, or a 25p movie recorded off-air. If you are sensitive to these microstutter issues, the solution is just to turn off intelligent frame creation. Video processing is strong on the Panasonic JZ2000. Upscaling was good, retrieving nice detail from this SMPTE RP133 test card in 576i without excessive ringing or fizziness, but we noticed that Panasonic has dispensed with the 1080p pixel by 4 pixels integer scaling option, which is probably obscure enough for most people not to care, just like the comedian Andrew Lawrence who made headlines recently. Who? Exactly. After watching a variety of standard definition and high definition programs on the Panasonic JZ2000, we had no complaints about its upscaling quality. Yes, the Sony A90J and A80J were even sharper, however slightly, but Panasonic's presentation came across a bit more organic and natural looking. When it came to video-based interlacing, the JZ2000 betrayed a touch more jaggies on this bouncing bars test pattern from the HQV benchmark disc compared to LG's and Sony's 2021 OLED TVs. With film cadence mode engaged, the television correctly detected and processed 3.2 and 2.2 cadences in film-based interlaced material. Full chroma bandwidth could be obtained by enabling the pure direct mode, but be aware that doing so would also break 5.5 pull-down, thus leading to telecinic judder, so we don't advise engaging pure direct for watching movies. Bright uniformity was excellent on our 65-inch Panasonic JZ2000 review unit, manifesting no significant dirty screen effect, bending or color tinting on full-field gray slides. In this sequence from Our Planet on Netflix, there's the faintest of Venetian blind effect, our terminology to describe faint horizontal lines on bright HDR elements, but it wasn't obvious on our review sample at all. We really had to go looking for it. Dark uniformity was overall clean at 4% above black, though with some reverse vignetting along both sides of the screen, more so at the bottom right corner, which didn't bother us in real viewing outside of full-field slides. Moving on to HDR, I've covered the JZ2000's peak brightness of 900 nits at the start of this video. DCI-P3 color gamut coverage came in at 99% UV, whereas Rec 2020 coverage was 79%. A calibrated peak brightness of 900 nits is easily the brightest on a 10% window at D65 white point among 2021 OLED televisions, at least at the time we filmed this video in July 2021. Just like previous Panasonic OLEDs, the JZ2000 adapted its HDR10 tone curve in response to Max CLL metadata to retain more specular highlight detail. Of course, some 4000 nit highlight detail would still look compressed even on a 900 nit OLED. In the face of stiff competition from the LG G1 and the Sony A90J with brighter OLED panels this year, Panasonic appeared to have increased the potency of the dynamic HDR effect control, which selectively boosted the luminance of certain HDR elements without affecting the overall APL or average picture level. In case you are worried that bright highlight detail would be blown out by such dynamic HDR boosting, we found the opposite to be true. For instance, engaging dynamic HDR effect would etch out the lightning within the lightnings in a clearer yet brighter fashion in this frame from Wonder Woman. Somewhat disappointingly, native 10-bit gradation on the Panasonic JZ2000 has gone backwards from the HZ2000, not only on this rotating quantization test pattern from the Spears & Munsell UHD HDR benchmark disc, but also in the skies of Kingsman as well as the Martian 4K Ultra HD Blu-rays. As mentioned earlier in this video, Panasonic doesn't offer any dedicated decontouring filter to mitigate this issue, and the MPEG Remaster spatial filter did nothing to smooth out the posterization. We even tried out the new Auto AI picture board to no avail. It would just shift the posterization to a different region due to different gamma profile. Among television manufacturers, Panasonic boasts the widest compatibility with various HDR formats in 2021, and the JZ2000 supports HDR10, HLG, HDR10+, and Dolby Vision, not to mention Dolby Vision IQ and HDR10+ adaptive ambient light compensation technologies. Similar to last year's HZ OLEDs from Panasonic, the JZ2000's Dolby Vision IQ mode features undefeatable sharpening, noise reduction, and even motion interpolation with no way of switching off this picture processing using the grayed out menu settings, which will reduce its appeal to video enthusiasts who dislike superfluous video processing. When we reviewed the Panasonic HZ2000 last year, we spotted some frame drops during scene cuts on certain Dolby Vision 4K Blu-rays, which could be eradicated by forcing player-led Dolby Vision. We did encounter frame drops upon scene cuts in Aquaman, which could be eradicated by switching to player-led Dolby Vision. This issue has been fixed on the JZ2000, with the same sequence in Aquaman playing smoothly without frame drops even with TV-led Dolby Vision. With game mode enabled, input lag measured 14 milliseconds at 60 fps, more than halving to a super responsive 6 milliseconds at 120 fps. What we like about the game mode on Panasonic TVs is that it can be engaged even within an accurate picture preset such as Filmmaker mode, allowing you to enjoy both accurate colors and low input lag at the same time. But there are some downsides to this approach, as I shall explain later in this video. Out of the 4 HDMI inputs available on the JZ2000, HDMI 1 and HDMI 2 are the HDMI 2.1 ports, each supporting ALLM, VRR and 4K 120Hz with an HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 40 gigabits per second, as confirmed by the EDIT readout from the excellent Meridio 7G signal generator. Note that HDMI 2 also carries out eARC duty, so if you are using eARC to pass through lossless audio from the JZ2000, you will be left with only one HDMI 2.1 port on HDMI 1. Unlike on Sony TVs, selecting the 4K 120 HDMI mode didn't remove Dolby Vision support, although Dolby Vision was still capped at 4K 60 fps, as you can see from the Xbox information screen. Just like what we observed on the Hisense U8GQ with a MediaTek chipset, the Panasonic JZ2000 displayed Dolby Vision VRR games from the Xbox Series X with plenty of distortions, especially during cutscenes and on in-game menus, prompting us to just abandon Dolby Vision and go with 4K 120Hz HDR10 output from the console, relying on HDRG instead for tone mapping. Talking of which, even though the Panasonic JZ2000 doesn't officially support HDRG, you can switch off HDR tone map to force the TV to hard clip, which is key to how HDRG works to prevent double tone mapping. On 2021 models such as the JZ2000, Panasonic has made the clipping threshold setting more granular, such that it can be adjusted in increments of 10 rather than 50 nits. The clipping threshold value will correspond exactly to the max TML and max FFTML parameters that you can set on HDRG compliant consoles. For example, setting clipping threshold to 500 nits on the GZ2000 will result in a clipping point and hence max TML of 500 nits on the Xbox Series X. A clipping threshold of 700 nits on the TV will lead you to set max TML to 700 nits on the console, and so on and so forth. After much experimentation, we concluded that a clipping threshold of 950 nits was the optimal setting to take full advantage of the natural hard clipping point and the highest peak brightness offered by the Panasonic GZ2000, and you should set your Xbox Series X and PS5 as such too. Due to limitations of the MediaTek chipset used, the GZ2000 currently could only display 4K 120 FPS video signal at halved vertical resolution, although to be fair, the loss of resolution wasn't really noticeable in console games. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart on the PS5 still looked stunning at 4K 120 FPS, thanks to OLED's insane contrast that remained intact in game mode. Panasonic has promised a firmware update later in the year to restore full 3840x2160 resolution at 120 FPS without VRR, and will make a future announcement regarding the status of 3840x2160 resolution at 120 FPS with VRR. But judging from the amount of signal interference we saw on this HDR10 mixed resolution test pattern at 120 FPS, let's just say that we're not optimistic about the prospect of 4K 120Hz, HDR and VRR all working simultaneously without a hitch on the GZ2000, or in fact any HDMI 2.1 TV using the MediaTek chipset. There is a VRR setting in the picture menu that has to be turned on manually before the TV will be recognized as VRR capable. We managed to get the NVIDIA G-Sync Pendulum demo to work from an RTX 3090 graphics card, allowing for buttery smooth motion without tearing or stuttering. Note that engaging VRR will also enable game mode and disable 5.5 pulldown, so you will need to disable VRR manually if you wish to watch movies on the same HDMI input without telecinic judder. Similarly, if you have disabled HDR tone map earlier to simulate HDRG when playing games, you will have to remember to re-enable HDR tone map to watch HDR movies on the same HDMI input, particularly those graded to 4000 nits. To avoid the hassle of having to make all these manual adjustments every time you switch from playing games to watching movies, and vice versa, it is recommended that you just play games on one HDMI input and watch movies on another HDMI input. Otherwise, the Panasonic GZ2000 reproduced full 444 chroma in game mode and exhibited some posterization even at the 10-bit level on this display HDR test pattern, matching what we saw in HDR films as discussed earlier in this video. VRR flicker remained present in certain games, especially on in-game menus. This is a hardware issue of the OLED module supplied by LG Display, and will affect all OLED televisions supporting VRR until the next hardware refresh. Design-wise, the OLED screen is supported on a swivel stand with a circular base. In addition to front-firing and up-firing speakers which have been tuned by Technics, the Panasonic GZ2000 also features a pair of side-firing speakers to provide an immersive Dolby Atmos experience. To optimize the sound for your viewing environment, we recommend going through the space tune adjustment procedure, although be warned that you have to wait a while for the process to complete while holding the remote control for the test tones to be registered on the microphone. It felt longer than the toilet queue on an EasyJet flight to Lanzarote. Overall, the speakers on the Panasonic GZ2000, marketed as 360-degree Soundscape Pro by the company, delivered the most convincing Atmos bubble we've heard from an in-TV audio system to date. Bass was sufficiently deep and powerful, and if that's still not enough for you, you basshead, you can connect an external subwoofer to the headphone jack and toggle the output through the user menu. We did find vocals to be a bit flat and shrill, slightly lacking in melodic clarity, but we suppose that's why most AV enthusiasts would go with an external home theater system with dedicated center channel at extra cost. We think the supplied remote control is a downgrade from the premium one shipped with Panasonic's previous flagship OLEDs. It has a nice weight to it and has plenty of buttons with good space in between, but the front fascia is now plastic rather than metallic, and the remote control is no longer backlit. The last thing we need is more instances of fumbling in the dark to try and find the right button. In contrast to LG's WebOS 6.0 and Sony's Google TV platforms, which take up the entire screen, Panasonic's My Home Screen 6.0 UI is lightweight and responsive, occupying only the bottom part of the screen. Many of the key streaming apps are available, including Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, YouTube, Rakuten TV, and all the UK catch-up TV apps thanks to Freeview Play, with notable omissions being Disney Plus and Apple TV. There is also a new My Scenery function which lets you display either preloaded or your own images or videos on screen, similar to what's offered by Samsung's Ambient Mode or the Screensaver mode on Android TV. Let's sum up. The Panasonic JZ2000 brings a number of improvements over last year's AZ2000 OLED. The long-standing issue of microstutter, however rare in smoky or foggy HDR movies, has now been fixed. There is no more frame skipping in TV-led Dolby Vision playback of certain Dolby Vision 4K Blu-rays. And of course, there's a host of gaming-related upgrades, including lower input lag, HDMI 2.1, 4K 120, and VRR support. However, it's not all good news, because the Panasonic JZ2000 actually regressed in a handful of areas compared with the AZ2000. Near black gradation appeared coarser on the JZ2000, and in fact, we noticed more posterization artifacts in 10-bit HDR movies than we've ever seen before on a Panasonic OLED. To clarify, the posterization on the JZ2000 wasn't visibly worse than what's found on the LG C1 and G1. Needless to say, the Sony A80J and A90J are the clear leader in this respect. But unlike LG, Panasonic hasn't provided any sort of smooth gradation decontouring filter to mitigate the issue. By now, some of you clever cookies may have already guessed the reason behind this deterioration in gradation, particularly above black. Near black being rendered at lower bit depth, no smooth gradation decontouring filter, half vertical resolution in 4K 120 mode. We've reported these findings on the Sony XH90 or X900H LED LCD before. Near black gradation appeared to be rendered at noticeably lower bit depth. There is no smooth gradation decontouring filter, and all signs point to the MediaTek HDMI 2.1 SoC being the culprit. To be fair, we don't think Panasonic had a choice. Unless a TV brand can develop its own SoC like what LG and Samsung have done, the company would have to go with a third-party SoC to add HDMI 2.1 capabilities, and the MediaTek chipset is by far the most mature on the open market, adopted not only by Panasonic, but also by Sony, Philips, Hisense, TCL, Vizio, basically every manufacturer besides LG and Samsung on their high-end TVs. Had Panasonic not offered HDMI 2.1 in the year 2021, they would have been lambasted by many, including ourselves. It is just a shame that the company had to give up its advantage in near black handling to add HDMI 2.1 gaming features, which don't really come close to matching what gaming leader LG Electronics is already offering on the C1 and G1. If I sounded a bit downbeat in this review, that is not my intention at all, so I apologize in advance. It is just that my expectations for any Panasonic flagship OLED are sky high, and I believe in presenting all the pros and cons of every TV I review to help you make an informed purchase decision. At the end of the day, the Panasonic JZ2000 is still one of the best OLED TV you can buy in 2021, with class-leading out-of-the-box color accuracy, outstanding shadow detailing, strong video processing, stable motion, impactful HDR by OLED standards, multi-HDR support, low input lag, and the most convincing Atmos bubble from any TV's onboard speakers. It earns our highly recommended award. To watch some of our other technical OLED TV reviews, please click here for our playlist, and I will see you in the next video.